The elk stood 70 yards downwind, its breath clouding an air so cold it burned to inhale. Werner Kohler raised his rifle, pressed his frost-numbed finger against the trigger, and felt nothing move. The mechanism had frozen solid again, just like it had 3 days ago when the deer escaped, and 5 days before that when the moose vanished into the timber. What happened in the desperate weeks that followed would solve one of the deadliest problems facing winter hunters across the northern Rockies, and the solution Werner discovered would become standard practice for every trapper who valued his life over his pride. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this grip you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale of wilderness ingenuity will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about mountain living. The winter of 1841 arrived early in the northern Rockies. By mid-November, snow already covered the high country in drifts that reached past a man's waist, and temperatures plunged to depths that made experienced trappers reconsider their career choices. But for men like Werner Kohler, winter was simply another season to endure, another test of skill and preparation that separated survivors from corpses. Werner had spent 8 winters in these mountains. He had come west from Pennsylvania in 1833, a German immigrant son who found the structured life of his father's cooperage suffocating. The frontier offered something his hometown never could: complete autonomy. Every decision was his own. Every success or failure belonged to him alone. He had learned trapping from a French-Canadian named Baptiste, survived 2 close encounters with grizzly bears, and built a reputation as a competent, reliable trapper who delivered quality pelts and caused no trouble. His partner that winter was Seamus O'Malley, an Irishman who had fled famine and British landlords 5 years earlier. Seamus was younger, only 26 to Werner's 34, but he understood mountain life with the quick adaptation common to men who had already survived one impossible situation. The two had partnered the previous season and worked well together. They shared labor, divided profits fairly, and maintained the comfortable silence of men who didn't need constant conversation to feel companionship. Their camp sat in a narrow valley along a creek that fed into the Yellowstone River drainage in what would eventually become southwestern Montana. The location provided access to beaver ponds, adequate timber for fuel and construction, and enough isolation to avoid territorial conflicts with other trappers or hostile encounters with various tribes who considered this their hunting ground. They had built a standard log cabin in late September, finishing just before the first heavy snow. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet, with notched corners, mud chinking, a stone fireplace, and a heavy plank door. It was adequate shelter, nothing more. Winter trapping required different skills than spring or fall work. Beaver were less active. Their pelts were at prime thickness, but catching them meant breaking ice, setting traps in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and checking lines in conditions that turned routine tasks into survival challenges. The real danger of winter wasn't the trapping itself, it was everything else. Food scarcity, equipment failure, accidents that would be minor inconveniences in summer but became death sentences when temperatures dropped below zero. Werner and Seamus both carried percussion cap rifles, the standard technology of the era. These weapons had replaced flintlocks over the previous decade, offering more reliable ignition and better performance in wet conditions. A percussion cap rifle used a small copper cap filled with fulminate of mercury. When struck by the hammer, the cap exploded, sending flame through a channel into the powder charge. The system worked remarkably well under most conditions, but most conditions didn't include sustained temperatures of 20 or 30 degrees below zero. December brought cold that went beyond discomfort into genuine danger. The thermometer Werner kept nailed to the cabin wall registered -28 degrees on the morning of December 9th, and that was in the relative warmth of midday. At night, temperatures dropped further, creating cold so intense that trees exploded from frozen sap expanding inside their trunks. The sharp cracks echoed through the forest like gunshots, startling men awake in their blankets. Werner had been tracking a mule deer for nearly 2 hours. The animal was a young buck, maybe 160 pounds of meat, that would supplement their dwindling food stores significantly. They still had beans, flour, and salt pork, but fresh meat made the difference between merely surviving winter and maintaining strength for the brutal work of checking trap lines. He had spotted the deer just after dawn, feeding in a small clearing where wind had swept snow off exposed grass. The stalk required patience. Deer in winter were skittish, aware that predators were as hungry as they were. Werner moved slowly, placing each footstep carefully to avoid crunching snow, using terrain and sparse vegetation for concealment. His breath clouded with each exhale, so he breathed shallowly through his nose, knowing that large vapor plumes would alert the deer to his presence. The cold penetrated his wool coat and buckskin shirt, settling into his bones, but he ignored it. Discomfort was irrelevant. The deer was what mattered. After 90 minutes of careful movement, he reached a position 40 yards from the buck. The animal was broadside, head down, completely unaware. Werner slowly raised his rifle, a .50 caliber percussion cap gun he had purchased in St. Louis 3 years earlier. He had maintained it carefully, cleaning it after every shot, keeping the mechanism oiled, protecting it from moisture. It was a reliable weapon that had never failed him. He settled the front sight behind the deer's shoulder, exhaled slowly, and pressed his finger against the trigger. Nothing happened. The trigger didn't move. He pressed harder. Still, nothing. The mechanism was completely frozen, the trigger lever refusing to pivot, regardless of how much pressure he applied. Werner kept the rifle aimed, hoping the cold metal would warm from his hands, but after 20 seconds, the deer raised its head, sensing something wrong. It bounded away in long leaps, disappearing into timber within moments. Werner lowered the rifle, staring at it with confusion and growing anger. He examined the trigger mechanism, seeing nothing obviously wrong. The hammer was cocked. The percussion cap was properly seated. Everything looked correct. He tried the trigger again. Frozen solid. He tucked the rifle inside his coat, trying to warm the metal with body heat. But his coat was cold too, and the temperature was too low for his body to generate enough warmth to matter. He returned to the cabin, furious at the lost opportunity. Inside, he held the rifle near the fireplace, letting heat from the flames warm the metal. After 5 minutes, he tested the trigger. It moved smoothly, clicking perfectly. The mechanism worked fine at room temperature, but outside, in the cold where he actually needed it, the rifle was useless. 3 days after Werner lost the deer, Seamus experienced the same failure. He had been checking trap lines along the creek when he spotted a cow moose feeding on willow branches. Moose meat was even more valuable than deer, a single animal providing enough food for weeks. Seamus stalked within range, aimed, pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. The moose walked away undisturbed, while Seamus stood helpless, his rifle mechanism locked solid by cold. That evening, both men sat by the fire, discussing the problem. They weren't panicking yet. Their food stores would last through winter if they were careful. But the rifle failures were concerning. They both understood that guns served purposes beyond hunting. A working rifle meant protection against grizzly bears, emerging hungry from dens, defense against wolves that grew bold when starving, and security against human threats in a region where law was whatever a man could enforce himself. They assumed the problem was moisture getting into the mechanisms. Seamus suggested keeping the rifles completely dry, never bringing them near the fire where condensation could form, storing them outside where they stayed at ambient temperature. Werner agreed it was worth trying. They wiped their rifles thoroughly, removed all traces of oil and grease from the trigger mechanisms, and hung them under the cabin's eave where they would stay cold and dry. The approach failed. 2 days later, Werner's trigger froze again during a hunt. The dry mechanism actually seemed worse, the metal parts binding against each other without lubrication. They went back to using light coats of bear grease, the standard lubricant for firearms. Sometimes the rifles worked. Sometimes they didn't. There seemed to be no pattern they could identify. January 7th, 1842, dawned clear and brutally cold. The thermometer showed -32 degrees. Seamus decided to hunt anyway. Their food situation was becoming serious. They had been in the mountains for 4 months with limited success. The beaver trapping was poor due to frozen waterways. Their hunting had been crippled by rifle failures. They needed meat. Werner stayed at camp that morning, repairing traps that had been damaged by ice. Seamus left before sunrise, heading into high country where elk sometimes wintered in protected valleys. He carried his rifle, 50 rounds of ammunition, his knife, and a small pack with emergency supplies. Werner watched him disappear into the forest, thinking nothing unusual about the day. By late afternoon, Seamus hadn't returned. Werner wasn't immediately concerned. Hunting often took longer than expected. But when darkness fell and Seamus still hadn't appeared, Werner felt the first stirrings of worry. He built up the fire and waited, telling himself that Seamus had probably decided to camp overnight rather than navigate treacherous terrain in darkness. The next morning, Werner followed Seamus's tracks. The trail was easy to read in the snow. Seamus had climbed into the high country, following a ridgeline for several miles before descending into a narrow valley. Werner found him 3 miles from camp. A grizzly bear had killed him. The scene told the story clearly. Seamus had surprised the bear, probably near its den. The bear had charged from close range. Seamus had raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. The rifle lay in the snow near his body, hammer still cocked, percussion cap still in place. Werner tested the trigger, frozen solid. Werner buried Seamus on a ridge overlooking their valley. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep, and digging the grave took most of a day. He piled stones over the site to protect it from scavengers and stood there as the sun set, looking at the mound of rocks that contained the only friend he had made in these mountains. Seamus had survived British oppression, crossed an ocean, and endured 5 brutal winters in the Rockies, only to die because a piece of metal wouldn't move when he needed it to. That night, Werner made a decision that would consume him for the next 2 months. He would solve the frozen trigger problem, or he would die trying. This wasn't about convenience anymore. It wasn't about lost hunting opportunities, it was about survival. A rifle that couldn't fire in cold weather was worse than no rifle at all because it created false confidence. A man carrying a useless gun thought he was armed when he was actually defenseless. Werner began with systematic observation. He completely disassembled his rifle's trigger mechanism, laying each component on his workbench in sequence. The system was relatively simple. The trigger was a lever that pivoted on a pin. When pulled, it released the sear, which held the hammer under spring tension. Once released, the hammer fell forward, striking the percussion cap and firing the gun. The entire mechanism involved perhaps a dozen metal parts, several pins, 2 springs, and various surfaces that needed to slide or pivot against each other. He studied each component individually. The trigger lever itself was steel, carefully shaped and hardened. The sear was also steel, with a precisely cut notch that engaged the hammer. The mainspring provided force to drive the hammer forward. A smaller spring returned the trigger to its forward position after firing. Everything was metal. Everything contracted when cold. Everything required some lubrication to function smoothly. Werner began experimenting with temperature. He took the disassembled mechanism outside, letting it reach ambient temperature in the -20-degree air. Then he brought individual pieces inside, warming them by the fire while keeping others cold. He discovered that the problem wasn't uniform. Some parts seemed more affected by cold than others. The trigger pivot was particularly prone to binding. The sear engagement point was another critical area. He tested his current lubrication, standard bear grease that trappers used for everything from waterproofing boots to cooking. He put a small amount on a metal plate and left it outside overnight. By morning, the grease had solidified into a waxy substance that was harder than cold butter. He tried to move it with his finger. It barely budged. Inside a trigger mechanism, this solidified grease wouldn't lubricate anything. It would act like glue, holding parts in place. Werner tried rendering the bear grease differently, heating it longer, straining it more carefully, adding small amounts of gunpowder, as some trappers claimed helped. Nothing worked. At extreme cold, bear grease froze. He needed a lubricant that stayed liquid at 30 degrees below zero, and he had no idea if such a substance existed. He also realized that lubrication was only part of the problem. Werner spent 3 weeks testing every solution he could imagine. The work became obsessive. He would wake before dawn, check his trap lines quickly, then return to spend hours experimenting with his rifle mechanism. Food became secondary. Sleep became irregular. The only thing that mattered was solving the problem that had killed Seamus. His first systematic attempt involved spring tension. He theorized that lighter springs would require less force to compress, making the mechanism easier to operate even when cold caused binding. He carefully filed down his mainspring, reducing its thickness by perhaps 1/16 of an inch. The modification made the trigger pull lighter, but it also made the hammer fall with less force. When he tested the rifle, the reduced hammer strike wasn't sufficient to reliably detonate percussion caps. He had created a new problem while failing to solve the original one. He tried the opposite approach, installing a heavier trigger spring to overpower any cold-induced binding. This made the trigger pull so heavy that accurate shooting became nearly impossible. His finger couldn't apply enough smooth pressure. The rifle jerked off target every time he pulled the trigger. Another failure. Werner experimented with mechanical modifications. He used files and scrapers to polish every surface where metal touched metal, reasoning that smoother surfaces would reduce friction. He spent 2 days polishing the sear engagement until it gleamed like a mirror. The modification helped slightly, but in extreme cold, the trigger still froze. He had reduced the problem, but not eliminated it. He tried widening the tolerances between moving parts, filing away tiny amounts of metal to create more clearance. The theory was sound. If parts had more room to move, thermal contraction wouldn't cause binding. But the execution created new issues. The wider tolerances made the trigger feel loose and imprecise. The sear engagement became unreliable. Sometimes the hammer would fall without the trigger being pulled, a dangerous malfunction that could kill someone. The lubrication experiments were equally frustrating. Werner tried every animal fat he could obtain. Beaver tail fat was supposedly superior for many applications, but it froze just like bear grease. Mink oil, which some trappers used for leather treatment, stayed liquid longer but still solidified around -20 degrees. Deer tallow was worse than bear grease. Even the fat from a lynx he had trapped, which seemed promising initially, turned solid in extreme cold. He tried mixing different substances: bear grease with pine pitch, mink oil with beeswax, various combinations of animal tikka fats with wood ash, hoping the ash would prevent freezing. Nothing worked. Every mixture he created either froze in cold weather or created so much friction it made the mechanism worse. His food situation became critical. He was burning through ammunition testing modifications, shooting at trees to verify function. Each test consumed a percussion cap and powder charge. More significantly, he wasn't hunting effectively. His focus on the trigger problem meant he wasn't checking trap lines properly, wasn't pursuing game with the patience required. He was slowly starving while obsessing over a mechanical puzzle he couldn't solve. Other trappers who passed through the area thought he was losing his mind. Angus MacDonald visited in late January, a Scottish trapper who worked territory 20 miles north. Angus had heard about Seamus's death and stopped to pay respects. He found Werner hunched over his workbench, surrounded by disassembled rifle parts and jars of various greases. When Angus asked what he was doing, Werner explained his attempts to solve the frozen trigger problem. Angus listened politely, then shook his head. "Guns freeze in winter, lad. Always have. It's the price of working these mountains. You accept it and move on." Werner said nothing, but Angus's words crystallized something in his mind. Most men accepted problems as inevitable. A few men refused to accept anything. After Angus left, Werner returned to his experiments with renewed determination. He had trapped a wolverine the previous week, primarily for its pelt, which commanded decent prices. Wolverines were notorious animals, fearless and aggressive, far beyond their size. Their fur had unique properties that made it valuable for parka hoods because frost didn't accumulate on wolverine fur the way it did on other furs. Werner was processing the pelt when he noticed something unusual. The wolverine's skin was covered in an oily substance that felt different from other animal fats. It was slick, almost slippery, and it didn't seem to thicken in the cold the way bear grease did. He had been working outside in -15-degree weather, and the wolverine fat on his hands remained fluid. Curiosity pushed him to test it properly. He scraped fat from the wolverine hide into a small tin cup. He placed a bit of bear grease in another cup for comparison. Both cups went outside overnight when the temperature dropped to -28 degrees. The next morning, the bear grease was solid. The wolverine fat had thickened slightly, but remained pliable, almost liquid. Werner's pulse quickened. He brought both samples inside and warmed them by the fire, then took them back outside. The bear grease went through a dramatic transformation from solid to liquid and back. The wolverine fat barely changed. It stayed consistent across temperature ranges that made other fats useless. He spent the next 2 days rendering pure oil from the wolverine carcass. The process was tedious. He cut the fat into small pieces, heated it slowly in a pot, strained out solids, and collected the clear oil that resulted. From one wolverine, he obtained perhaps 2 ounces of pure fat, a small amount, but enough to test. He applied wolverine oil to his trigger mechanism, working it into every pivot point and sliding surface. Then he took the reassembled rifle outside into -25-degree air. He let it sit for an hour, cold-soaking every component. When he pulled the trigger, it moved smoothly. Clean, crisp release. No binding, no hesitation. Werner tested it repeatedly over the next week, in temperatures ranging from 0 to -32 degrees. The trigger worked every single time. He had found his lubricant. The wolverine oil solved the lubrication problem, but Werner quickly realized it wasn't a complete solution. Even with proper lubrication, the trigger occasionally hesitated in the most extreme cold. The hesitation was brief, maybe a half-second delay, but in a life-threatening situation, a half-second could mean death. He needed to address the mechanical issues he had identified during his earlier experiments. Werner returned to the problem of metal contraction. When steel got cold, it shrank. In a precisely fitted mechanism, that shrinkage created binding at critical points. He couldn't prevent the contraction, but he could engineer around it. He began making careful modifications to his trigger assembly, working with files so fine they removed metal in amounts barely visible to the eye. The trigger pivot was his first target. He widened the hole where the pivot pin passed through by perhaps 0.02 of an inch, an amount he measured by feel rather than instruments. The modification was subtle enough that it didn't create sloppiness, but it gave the pin room to accommodate thermal contraction without binding. He made similar modifications to every pivot point in the mechanism. The sear engagement required different treatment. This was where the trigger released the hammer, and the surfaces needed to be both smooth and precisely angled. Werner had already polished these surfaces to a mirror finish during earlier experiments. Now he added a new element. He had noticed that graphite, the black material in certain rocks used for marking, had lubricating properties. Trappers sometimes used graphite powder on squeaky door hinges. He scraped graphite from soft stones he found near camp, creating a fine powder. He mixed this powder with a tiny amount of wolverine oil, creating a thin paste. He applied this paste to the sear engagement surfaces and let it dry. The result was a slick, dry coating that combined the temperature-stable properties of wolverine oil with the solid lubrication of graphite. Even if the oil component somehow failed, the graphite would still reduce friction. Werner also modified his mainspring. Not the dramatic reduction he had tried earlier, but a subtle weakening achieved by careful filing. He reduced the spring thickness by perhaps 5%, enough to slightly decrease the force required to compress it, but not enough to compromise hammer strike. The lighter spring meant the trigger mechanism needed to overcome less resistance when operating in cold. He created a drainage channel in the lock plate, a tiny groove that allowed any moisture that entered the mechanism to drain out rather than pooling where it could freeze. The groove was nearly invisible, but it provided an escape route for condensation or melted snow. Finally, Werner developed a handling protocol. He would never bring his cold rifle directly to a warm fire. Temperature shock created condensation inside the mechanism. Instead, he would warm the rifle gradually, or, better yet, keep it at ambient temperature. He would never breathe on the mechanism, never expose it to moisture unnecessarily. The complete system was ready for field testing. Early February brought weather that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. Werner woke to -35-degree temperatures, cold so intense that water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground. Under normal circumstances, he would have stayed in the cabin, burning firewood and waiting for conditions to moderate. But his food situation was desperate. He had perhaps 2 weeks of supplies remaining, and winter still had 6 weeks to run. He applied wolverine oil to his trigger mechanism using a small brush made from animal hair. He worked the oil into every pivot point, coating each surface that required lubrication. Then he wiped away excess, leaving only a thin film. He checked the graphite coating on the sear engagement, adding a tiny amount where it had worn. The entire maintenance process took 10 minutes. Werner left the cabin before sunrise, his rifle slung across his back. He had spotted elk tracks 2 days earlier in a valley 3 miles west. Elk were dangerous to hunt alone, particularly bulls that could weigh 700 pounds and defend themselves aggressively if wounded. But Werner was past caring about risk. He needed meat or he would starve. The stalk took 4 hours. He found the elk herd bedded in a protected draw where wind couldn't reach them. 13 animals, including 1 mature bull. Werner worked his way into position with the patience of a man who understood that rushing meant failure. The cold was excruciating. His fingers went numb inside his mittens. His face felt frozen, despite the wool scarf wrapped around it. But he kept moving, placing each step carefully, using terrain and scattered brush for concealment. At 70 yards, he found a shooting position behind a fallen log. The bull was quartering away, not an ideal angle, but acceptable. Werner removed his right mitten, letting his trigger finger warm briefly against his body. Then he raised the rifle, settling into a solid rest on the log. The bull's shoulder filled his sight picture. He pressed the trigger. The release was clean and immediate. No hesitation, no binding. The rifle fired perfectly, the recoil pushing back against his shoulder as black powder smoke obscured his vision. When the smoke cleared, the bull was down. The other elk scattered, crashing through snow as they fled. Werner sat behind the log for a moment, feeling something close to triumph. His rifle had worked in conditions that would have frozen any standard mechanism solid. Processing the elk took the rest of the day. Werner quartered the massive animal, working methodically despite exhaustion and cold. He cached the meat in a tree where wolves couldn't reach it, then made 2 trips carrying loads back to his cabin. By nightfall, he had secured enough food to last through the remainder of winter. Over the next 2 weeks, Werner hunted successfully 4 more times, each hunt in extreme cold. Each rifle functioned flawless. The system worked. Word traveled slowly through the scattered trapping community, but it traveled by late February. Several trappers had heard that Werner Kohler was hunting successfully in weather that made everyone else's rifles useless. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others were curious enough to investigate. Angus MacDonald returned in early March. He had experienced 3 frozen trigger failures in the past month, losing game animals each time. His food situation was becoming serious. When he asked Werner directly how he was hunting in extreme cold, Werner showed him everything: the wolverine oil, the mechanical modifications, the graphite coating, the handling protocols. He explained his reasoning for each element and demonstrated the maintenance process. Angus listened carefully, asked technical questions, and spent 2 days at Werner's cabin learning the system. When he left, he carried a small jar of wolverine oil and detailed knowledge of the modifications needed. Werner gave the oil freely and asked nothing in return. His goal wasn't profit, it was preventing other men from dying the way Seamus had died. 3 weeks later, Angus returned with Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a French-Canadian trapper who worked territory along the Missouri River drainage. Jean-Baptiste had lost his rifle's functionality completely during a cold snap and had been forced to abandon his trap lines early. He needed a solution, or he would leave the mountains permanently. Werner repeated his demonstration and explanations. Jean-Baptiste was a skilled craftsman, and he grasped the mechanical principles immediately. The spring rendezvous of 1842 brought together perhaps 40 trappers from across the northern territories. These gatherings were part business, part social event, and part information exchange. Men traded furs, purchased supplies, shared news, and discussed techniques that worked or failed. Werner attended reluctantly, still uncomfortable in large groups, but Angus and Jean-Baptiste had both urged him to come. When conversation turned to equipment and techniques, several trappers mentioned rifle failures in cold weather. Angus spoke up, describing Werner's solution. Interest was immediate. Some trappers were skeptical, but most recognized that frozen triggers were a genuine problem that cost them meat and potentially their lives. Werner found himself surrounded by men asking questions, requesting demonstrations, and seeking his advice. He spent 3 days at Rendezvous teaching his system to anyone interested. He demonstrated the Wolverine oil preparation, explained the mechanical modifications, and answered technical questions. Some trappers, like Lars Eriksson, a Swedish immigrant, immediately understood the principles and began planning their own implementations. Others needed repeated explanations before grasping why each element mattered. By the time Rendezvous ended, at least 15 trappers had committed to trying Werner's approach. Several had already begun trading for Wolverine pelts, which suddenly became more valuable as men realized the fat was worth more than the fur. Werner left the gathering with mixed feelings. He was glad to share knowledge that might save lives, but he was uncomfortable being the center of attention. The following winter would prove whether his system worked for others or only for him. Winter of 1842 through 1843 validated Werner's system beyond any doubt. Jean-Baptiste Moreau sent word through traveling trappers that he had hunted successfully through sustained -30-degree weather without a single trigger failure. Lars Eriksson reported similar success, adding his own refinement by mixing Wolverine oil with a small amount of rattlesnake fat, which he claimed improved cold weather performance even further. Angus MacDonald survived a grizzly bear encounter in January because his rifle fired when needed, dropping the animal at 15 yards. By 1844, the technique had spread throughout the northern Rockies trapping community. Trading posts began stocking Wolverine pelts specifically for trigger oil production. Gunsmiths in St. Louis and Independence started offering cold-weather trigger modifications to customers heading west, charging premium prices for work that Werner had shared freely. The term Kohler trigger became common usage among mountain men, though Werner himself never claimed ownership of the innovation. The system saved lives in ways that could be documented and many more ways that couldn't. A trapper named Marcus Holloway wrote in his journal that Werner's trigger modification allowed him to defend against a wolf pack that attacked his camp in February of 1845. Another trapper, whose name was never recorded, left a note at a trading post thanking Werner for sharing knowledge that let him feed his Indian wife and children through a brutal winter. Military explorers and survey teams adopted similar principles when operating in northern territories. Army gunsmiths incorporated cold weather modifications into rifles issued for winter campaigns. The knowledge Werner had developed through desperation and experimentation became standardized practice across frontier applications, where reliable firearms meant survival. Werner himself left the mountains in 1849. The fur trade had collapsed completely by then, beaver populations depleted, and fashion moving away from felt hats. He traveled to California during the gold rush, not to mine but to establish a gunsmith shop in Sacramento. His specialty was cold-weather rifle work, and he trained several apprentices in techniques he had pioneered. He married in 1851 a widow named Catherine who ran a boarding house. They had 2 children who survived to adulthood. Werner Kohler died on March 12, 1867, at age 63. The Sacramento newspaper ran a brief obituary mentioning his gunsmith business and community involvement. Nothing about frozen triggers or wilderness innovation. His children knew their father had been a trapper once, but he rarely discussed those years. The mountains were part of a past he had survived and moved beyond. But in cabins scattered across Montana, Wyoming, and the Northern Territories, hunters still prepared their rifles using techniques Werner had developed. They rendered Wolverine fat into oil, applied graphite coatings, made careful mechanical modifications, and followed handling protocols that kept their weapons functional in impossible cold. Most didn't know Werner's name. They simply knew the system worked. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered.